What do you do when your wife orders you to apologize to her ex, and the only answer that keeps your dignity is a smile, a pen, and a set of papers she never believed existed, until she sees the date and realizes you were ready before she returned? My name is Daniel Cross, and I learned the hard way that love can become a contract nobody reads until the penalties arrive. Lila and I used to move like a single unit through the world, efficient and confident, the kind of couple that made other people lower their voices when we entered a room. Somewhere along the line, that unity turned into choreography, and then it turned into performance, and then it turned into exhaustion. We stopped arguing because arguments required hope, and we stopped touching because touch required trust, and we stopped making plans because plans required a future we could both imagine. I told myself it was a phase, because men like me always call the slow collapse a phase until the roof caves in. The night she demanded I apologize to her ex was the night I realized she had been living in a different marriage for a long time. It happened on a Tuesday that smelled like wet pavement and reheated coffee, the kind of day where the city looks tired and nobody meets your eyes on the sidewalk. I had come home early because the building's elevator had stalled again, and the superintendent asked me to sign for a service appointment that kept getting rescheduled. I was still in my coat when I saw the living room arranged like a stage, with the lamps angled brighter than usual and the couch cushions lined up with a precision Lila never used for us. The front door was half open, not because someone forgot, but because someone wanted the hallway to hear. I did not see him at first, because Lila's presence took up all the space, rigid posture, sharp eyes, that familiar look she used when she wanted to win without effort. Then I noticed the second shadow near the entryway, lean and patient, like a man who enjoys waiting for other people to lose control. Grant Mercer looked older than his photos, but not humbled by it, and that detail told me everything I needed to know. He had the easy grin of someone who is always welcomed back into rooms he should have been banned from. He stood with his hands open at his sides, like he was there for peace, like his presence wasn't already an accusation. Lila had never mentioned him without a protective tone, the way people talk about an old addiction they insist they have mastered. In our early years, she called him a mistake, and then she called him a lesson, and then she stopped calling him anything at all. Silence, I discovered, was not closure, and it was never neutral. She did not ease into it, because Lila never eased into anything that mattered to her pride. Her voice rose fast, already sharpened, already loud enough to bounce into the corridor and make the neighbor's cat stop scratching at our door. She told me I had humiliated her, that I had been cold, that I had acted like she was nothing at a dinner last weekend, and that Grant was the only person there who had shown her respect. She stacked complaints like dishes in a sink, one on top of another, until the pile became something you could drown in. Then she pointed at him, as if pointing made him an authority, and she demanded I apologize to my ex, because in her mind, the story had already flipped, and I was the one who had brought a toxic past into the room. I watched her mouth form the words, watched her eyes hold mine like a clamp, and I felt something in me go quiet. It was not anger, because anger is noisy and generous, and I had been generous long enough. It was not sadness, because sadness still bargains, and I had stopped bargaining months ago. What I felt was the calm you get when you finally see the shape of a trap, and you realize it was never meant to catch the other person. It was meant to make you jump, meant to make you flail, meant to make you look dangerous in front of a witness. Grant did not speak, but he did not need to, because his whole posture was a bet placed on my reaction. I could almost hear the version of me he wanted to summon. Fists clenched, voice raised, veins visible, the kind of man who makes everyone else look reasonable. Lila waited for me to snap because she loved certainty, and my calm always felt like sabotage to her. She repeated herself, louder, sharper, as if volume could turn her demand into a law. She said she would leave me if I refused, and she said it with that theatrical finality she had practiced, the kind you use when you want a room to remember your line. In the past, I would have argued, and I would have listed sacrifices, and I would have tried to prove my loyalty like a man defending himself in court. Instead, I felt my face settle into something almost gentle, and I surprised myself by smiling. It was not a warm smile, not the kind you give someone you love, but the kind you give a cashier when you have exact change and no interest in conversation. I stepped out of my coat, hung it on the hook, and walked past them as if they were guests who had overstayed their welcome. The folder was not hidden, because I never hid it, and that was the point. It sat in the top drawer of the side table near the window, beneath a stack of old mail and a spare set of keys. I had placed it there weeks ago, after the third time Lila came home late and offered an explanation that sounded pre-written. I had placed it there after the first time she said the word space like it was a medical prescription. I had placed it there the morning I realized she could look straight at me and describe a day she had not lived. I did not draft it in a rage, and I did not draft it as a threat, and that made it stronger than any shouting match. Paper does not care about your emotions, and ink never loses a fight to charm. When I returned to the living room, I held the folder flat in my hand, letting them see the weight of it. Lila's eyes tracked it first, because she was always drawn to objects that could become leverage. Grant's expression changed almost imperceptibly, the grin shifting into something smaller, more calculating, like he was trying to name the game before the rules were explained. I stopped a few steps away from them and set the folder on the coffee table with a quiet finality. I told her not to forget to sign the papers, and I said it in the same tone I used when reminding her to renew the car insurance. The words landed in the room like a glass set down too hard, and the silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Lila's face went pale in a way that betrayed her, because she could fake anger convincingly, but she could not fake surprise. Her mouth opened and closed once, like her brain had tripped over a missing step. She demanded to know what papers I was talking about, and for the first time in months, her voice was not a weapon, but a question she did not control. I did not answer right away because I wanted her to feel the gap, the space where she expected me to plead. I wanted her to notice that I was no longer performing for her, and that the performance she had arranged with Grant was now irrelevant. In the corner of my eye, I saw Grant shift his weight, and I could tell he suddenly wanted to be anywhere else, because this was not a romantic scene anymore. This was administration, and administration is where fantasies go to die. I opened the folder slowly, not for drama, but because rushing would have made it look emotional, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. Inside were pages arranged cleanly, each one printed, each one flagged, each one prepared for a signature that would not be begged for. The first page was a separation agreement drafted with the kind of plain language that leaves no room for creative interpretation. The second page outlined the division of assets, the apartment lease, the shared account, the car, and the furniture that had become more symbolic than useful. There were pages for temporary terms, pages for communication boundaries, and pages for what would happen if one of us tried to weaponize reputation. I had learned that people who threaten to leave often do not expect you to open the door for them. Lila looked down at the paperwork like it was an insult written in a language she suddenly understood. She tried to recover control the way she always did, by turning my calm into cruelty. She asked if I had planned this, as if planning was a betrayal, as if preparation was worse than her public ultimatum. She accused me of hiding things, and that accusation would have been funny if it had not been so revealing. I told her I had not hidden anything, and I kept my voice even, because evenness was the only weapon I needed. I explained that when you demand an apology under threat, you are already walking away, and all I did was provide the paperwork for the exit she kept rehearsing. I also explained that if Grant was here as her support, then he could watch her sign like an adult, because witnesses were clearly important to her now. Grant's jaw tightened slightly, and his eyes flicked toward the hallway again, calculating the risk of staying on a sinking stage. Lila's gaze snapped up to mine, searching for the crack, searching for the old fear she used to pull me back into line. She did not find it, and that absence rattled her more than any insult. She tried to turn the conversation toward morality, toward loyalty, toward what a husband should do, because those were the arguments that usually trapped me. I listened without interrupting, because interrupting would have made it a fight, and fights were what she used to rewrite history later. When she finally paused, I told her there was one simple choice in front of her, and it was not about Grant, and it was not about apologies, and it was not about pride. It was about whether she wanted to keep using threats as currency in a marriage that was already bankrupt. Then I slid the pen across the table toward her, and I watched her hands hover over it like touching it might make the reality permanent. The strangest part was not her fear, but how quickly it turned into calculation, like a switch flipped behind her eyes. She glanced at Grant as if seeking backup, but he did not offer it, because men like him only support you when it costs them nothing. He looked at the papers, then at me, then at her, and I could see him realizing that he had been invited into a private disaster he did not own. Lila straightened her shoulders again, rebuilding the mask, and she asked what I thought I was doing with this, as if it were a stunt. I leaned back slightly and let my silence answer first, because silence forces people to fill it with their own fear. Then I told her I was doing the only thing she never expected from me, which was believing her the first time she threatened to leave. Her breath caught, and in that tiny break I saw the real crack in her story. She had not brought Grant here for closure, and she had not brought him here because she needed an apology, and she had not brought him here because she loved him. She had brought him here because she wanted a witness to my collapse, a witness who would later confirm her version of the night. She wanted to leave with a narrative, not just a suitcase, and she wanted the narrative to paint her as brave and me as unstable. I had seen that pattern before in smaller ways, the careful phrasing, the timed silences, the sudden tears when someone else walked into the room. Now the pattern was sitting on my coffee table in black ink, and it was daring her to gamble. Lila stared at the first signature line as if it were a trap door, and my smile returned, colder but steadier, because I finally understood what kind of war she had been staging. I did not need to raise my voice to win, because she had already written the threat, and all I had done was print it out and hand it back to her. Grant shifted again, closer to the door now, and I realized he was afraid of paperwork more than he was afraid of me. Lila licked her lips, eyes flicking between the pen and my face, as if she could still negotiate control with a look. I waited, because waiting is how you let someone feel the consequences they tried to outsource. Then my phone buzzed softly on the counter behind me, and I knew from the timing that the next piece of proof had just arrived. The buzz from my phone was not dramatic, but it was perfectly timed, and timing is what separates panic from control. I walked to the counter without rushing, because rushing would have suggested I was reacting instead of confirming, and I had promised myself I would never again react on her schedule. The screen lit up with a merchant alert from an account in my name, the kind of clean little notification that never raises its voice, yet still manages to ruin your evening. It showed a charge from a boutique hotel 2 miles away, posted less than 20 minutes earlier, and my first thought was not jealousy, because jealousy is sentimental, but arithmetic. We were standing in my living room, in my home, with my wife demanding ultimatums and her ex acting like a guest speaker, while my card was paying for a hotel room someone had just checked into. I stared at the notification long enough to lock it into memory. Then I took a screenshot and set the phone face down, because I did not need either of them watching my eyes move. The room felt smaller after that, as if the walls had leaned in to listen, and I could sense Lila's attention shifting even before she asked what I was doing. She had always been able to smell evidence the way certain animals smell weather, and her instinct was to kill it before it could breathe. Grant's gaze flicked toward my phone with a fraction of curiosity, then returned to Lila with the faint irritation of a man realizing he was not the only variable in the equation. I returned to the coffee table and sat across from them, posture relaxed, hands open, and I noticed how much Lila hated when I looked comfortable. Comfortable meant I was not afraid of her anger, and her anger was one of the last tools she still believed in. She reached for the pen again, then stopped, then moved her fingers away as if the metal could burn her, and I watched her trying to rebuild momentum. She did it the way she always did, by attempting to force an emotional argument, because emotions can be recut, rephrased, and reheated later. Paper cannot be reheated, and neither can a timestamp on a charge that should not exist. Grant finally spoke in the lightest possible way, like he was testing whether the air was safe to breathe. He made a comment about how serious this looked, a tone meant to imply that I was overreacting to a marital disagreement. I did not snap at him, because snapping would have been a gift, and I did not thank men like him for showing up late to my life. I looked at him with the mild patience you reserve for someone who has wandered into the wrong meeting, and I told him calmly that he did not need to stay, because I was not negotiating with him. That line hit him harder than an insult would have, because it erased him without acknowledging his importance, and I saw the quick tension in his jaw as he recalculated what he thought this evening was supposed to be. Lila's eyes narrowed and her voice rose again, trying to reclaim the room through volume, but her pace was off now, like a dancer missing the beat. She kept circling the separation agreement as if it were an ambush, insisting that I was manipulating her, insisting that I had planned to humiliate her, insisting that I was cold and cruel for pulling paperwork instead of talking. The irony was thick enough to taste, because she had brought her ex into our home like a prop, and she still wanted to accuse me of turning private problems into a show. I let her speak until she ran out of breath, because the best way to reveal a script is to let it play out uninterrupted. When she stopped, I lifted the first page of the agreement and tapped the section that outlined boundaries about third parties being brought into the marital home during disputes. I did not need to say much, because the paper said it for me, with indifferent clarity. Her eyes moved over the lines, and the first crack in her certainty widened, because she realized I had anticipated her tactics instead of being blindsided by them. That was when she made her first real mistake, the kind that happens when someone tries to improvise on a stage where the lights are too bright. She mentioned that Grant had only come over because she needed a ride back from a meeting that ended late, and she said it quickly, hoping speed would make it sound plausible. I did not correct her immediately, because I wanted the lie to settle into the room and become something she could not retract without visible effort. Then I asked one simple question about the time of that meeting. Nothing theatrical, just a date and an hour. She answered without thinking because she was used to me absorbing her explanations like water absorbs dye. The moment her answer landed, I watched her realize she had chosen the wrong time window because her eyes flicked toward my phone again, and that flick told me she had noticed I had done something with it. Grant shifted in his seat, suddenly less relaxed, because even he could sense that the air had changed. I opened my phone again, slowly, and held it in a way that made it visible, but not in a way that looked like a threat. I did not shove it at her, because shoving invites a struggle, and I was not running a wrestling match in my own living room. I read the hotel charge details out loud in a flat, administrative tone, naming the merchant and the time, and I watched the color drain from Lila's face in a way that even makeup could not disguise. She tried to speak, then stopped, then tried again, and for a brief second she looked truly cornered, not by me, but by the fact that reality had produced a receipt with perfect timing. Grant reacted fast, the way men react when they realize the story they joined is not the story they were promised. He leaned forward slightly and asked what hotel it was, as if he needed to confirm something for himself, and that single question told me more than any confession would have. Lila snapped her gaze to him, and the snap was sharp enough to expose how little she wanted him involved in the part of the truth that had numbers attached. She said the charge had to be a mistake, that my card must have been compromised, that maybe the hotel had pre-authorized something from a past trip, and she threw explanations at the air like handfuls of sand. The problem with sand is that it does not stick, and the problem with timestamps is that they do. I asked her, in the same calm tone, if she wanted me to call the bank right then and dispute it, because the best way to test a lie is to offer a clean, immediate solution. She hesitated for half a second too long, and that hesitation was the confession she did not know she had given. Her eyes moved from my phone to the folder to Grant and back again, like she was searching for a doorway that had vanished. She then pivoted to anger, because when fear fails, anger becomes the emergency mask. She accused me of spying on her finances, which was almost funny, because the account was mine and the alert was automatic, and I did not need to spy on anything that was already attached to my name. Grant rose from the couch as if his legs had decided for him, and he muttered something about giving us space, because men like him love the word space when consequences arrive. He walked toward the door, but he did it slowly, watching Lila's face to see whether she would stop him. She did not stop him, and that was another confession, because if he was only a harmless ex, she would have kept him as backup. Instead, she let him drift out of the room like smoke, and the moment he stepped into the hallway, the power dynamic changed again. Lila was no longer performing in front of an ally, and now she was facing me without a witness she controlled. When the door closed behind him, Lila tried to soften her expression, switching tactics in a way that would have impressed me years ago. She told me she had been under stress, that she had been lonely, that she had felt unseen, and she tried to build a bridge made of emotion because she could not cross on facts. I listened, because listening costs nothing, and it makes people reveal patterns. The pattern was clear now, not just infidelity, but strategy, because she did not talk like someone who had made a mistake. She talked like someone who had prepared a narrative and expected the narrative to be enough. I did not call her names, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not mention the word cheating yet, because I did not want to give her a dramatic label to fight. Labels become debates, and debates become fog, and fog is where liars hide. Instead, I told her that what I needed from her was not an apology, and it was not a promise, and it was not another performance. What I needed was for her to sign the paperwork or refuse to sign it clearly, with the understanding that refusal would not stop the process. Her eyes widened slightly at that, because she had assumed she could stall by flooding the room with feelings. She did not understand that I had already moved beyond the stage where delay could work. She asked what I thought I was going to do, and there was a tremor under her voice that she could not quite bury. I reminded her calmly that separation does not require mutual enthusiasm, only documentation and follow-through. Then I slid a second document forward, 1 page, plain and blunt, outlining temporary financial boundaries, including a freeze on joint discretionary spending and a separation of payment responsibilities. Her gaze locked onto that line, and her fear sharpened, because she understood money in a way she did not always understand loyalty. She started to argue, but her argument stumbled, because every sentence she tried to build ran into the fact that a hotel charge had just landed on my phone. I stood and walked to the window, not to be dramatic, but to give my body distance from her volatility. Outside, the streetlight reflected on wet asphalt, and a car passed with music muffled behind closed glass, as if the world was reminding me that other people were still living ordinary lives. I turned back and told her I would give her one night to decide how she wanted to handle this, because even endings deserve structure. I also told her she would not be staying in this apartment tonight because threats had turned into actions, and I was done treating our home like a rehearsal space. She stared at me like she could not believe I had said it out loud, and then she looked down at the folder again, as if the paper had grown teeth. Her phone, which had been silent until then, lit up on the couch cushion where she had left it. The screen flashed a name without showing the message content, but the name was enough, because it was not Grant. It was a contact saved as Evan Vendor, and the timing was too neat to be coincidence. Lila reached for the phone too quickly, and the speed betrayed her more than any words could have. She snatched it, thumb already moving, and I saw the brief panic in her eyes when she realized I had noticed the name. I did not stop her, because stopping her would have made it a confrontation, and I did not want a confrontation yet. I wanted a record, and I wanted her to keep making decisions that left clean footprints. I pointed at the folder and told her to take it with her if she wanted to read it, because I was not hiding anything, and hiding was her profession now, not mine. She stood there for a moment, rigid, breathing shallow, trying to decide whether to fight or flee. Then she grabbed her coat and the folder in one movement, like a person collecting belongings after a failed audition. At the door she paused, and for a second I thought she might try one last threat, one last line meant to drag me back into old dynamics. Instead, she only looked at me with a mixture of rage and dread, and that mixture told me she knew the ground had shifted beneath her. When she finally stepped into the hallway, I closed the door gently, because gentleness is what makes finality feel unavoidable. I locked it, not because I thought she would break in, but because I wanted the sound of the lock to be a punctuation mark. Then I returned to my phone, opened the screenshot folder, and began labeling the evidence with dates and times, because revenge is not a tantrum. Revenge, the kind that actually works, is paperwork that arrives before the excuses do. As I created a fresh entry in my evidence ledger, a new notification appeared on the screen, and this one was not from the bank. It was an email subject line in our shared inbox, and it read like a knife disguised as a calendar update. The email subject line sat in our shared inbox like a polite threat, formatted with corporate cheerfulness that made it worse. It was one of those automated confirmations that pretends to be helpful, with a neat timestamp and a sender address that looked harmless until you read it twice. The subject said that an itinerary had been updated, and it included the phrase "two guests" in a way that was too specific to be accidental. I opened it with the same calm I used when reading a medical chart, because panic is what liars hope for, and calm is what exposes them. The body was short, mostly template language, but the header told the real story, because headers are the part that does not care about your feelings. I did not forward it, and I did not reply, and I did not call anyone, because I knew how quickly a smart opponent can spin a simple action into a narrative about control. Instead, I took a screenshot that captured the subject line, the timestamp, and the preview line that mentioned names without explaining context. Then I printed it to PDF using the simplest method on my own device, because paper feels heavier than pixels, and weight changes how people behave. I slid the PDF into a folder I had created an hour earlier, a folder with a name that sounded boring enough to be ignored, and I knew that if this went where it had to go, boring would become beautiful. Sleep did not come in the normal way that night, because my mind did not trust darkness anymore. I lay on the couch, not because I was exiled, but because I wanted the bedroom to stay untouched, like a sealed scene. Around 3 a.m, I heard the soft vibration of my phone again, and the sound was more honest than any apology. It was another merchant alert, smaller, from a late-night place, with a name that sounded like a cocktail bar, pretending to be a restaurant. The amount was not large, but the timing was perfect, and the perfectness of it irritated me more than the money. She had always been careless with timing, because she believed my role in her life was to forgive, not to measure. At dawn, I made coffee and opened a fresh page in my evidence ledger, the old-fashioned kind that forces you to think in lines. I wrote the date, the times, and the basic facts with no adjectives, because adjectives invite arguments. I listed the hotel charge, the itinerary email, and the new late-night merchant alert. And then I wrote the one thing that mattered most. All of it was tied to accounts or devices that were legally mine. No hacking, no tricks, no secret cameras, no borrowed access, just her own trail circling back to my name like smoke finding its way into vents. By mid-morning, my phone showed a missed call from Lila, then 2 more, then a text that was longer than she usually wrote when she thought she still had leverage. She did not apologize. Not really, because apologies require admitting what you did, and she was still trying to keep the act intact. She wrote that we needed to talk like adults, that she had been under pressure, that I had embarrassed her by making a scene in front of Grant, and that I was acting like a stranger. The last line was almost funny, because she had spent a year treating me like furniture, and now she was offended I had started moving. I did not reply, because replies are oxygen, and I was trying to starve the fire without letting the smoke fill my lungs. Instead, I opened our shared calendar and scrolled back through the last month of entries that were still visible to me. There were gaps where she had once filled in details, but the gaps were not empty, because empty space is a pattern too. I noticed a repeating block labeled as a committee planning session, always at the same time, always in the late afternoon, always paired with a vague note about staying late. It looked like routine, the kind of routine people use to stop their partner from asking questions, because routine feels like safety. I exported the week view as a PDF, the one that showed the committee blocks stacked like bricks, and I saved it next to the email screenshot and the merchant alerts. Then I compared the dates of the committee sessions to the merchant alerts and the hotel charge, not expecting perfect overlap, because real life is messy. The overlap was not perfect, but it was close enough to suggest intention, and intention is what separates a mistake from a strategy. I wrote a new line in the ledger about the calendar pattern, and I felt something tighten in my chest that was not heartbreak, but irritation at how predictable her deception had become. Around noon, my doorbell camera sent me a standard motion alert, the kind I usually ignore because a passing delivery driver is not interesting. I opened the still frame anyway, and the timestamp in the corner caught my attention before the image did. The person in the frame was Lila, standing in the hallway with her shoulders squared, holding her phone like a shield. Behind her, partially visible in the angle of the camera, was Grant's silhouette, close enough to be part of the same scene. They were not kissing, not hugging, not doing anything dramatic. But they were there together, and the timestamp mattered because she had told me she was coming alone. I saved the still frame and labeled it with the date and time. Then I opened the next still frame, because doorbell cameras do not just capture one moment. In the second image, Grant's face was clearer, and he looked like a man who did not expect to be recorded at a married man's door in the middle of the day. In the third image, Lila glanced sideways at him with that quick, silent communication that couples develop when they think nobody is watching. I did not need more, and I did not feel triumphant, because this was not a victory. It was another brick added to a wall she had built around herself, and I was just documenting the architecture. I waited a full minute before opening the door, because I wanted them to feel what it was like to stand outside and not be invited in. When I finally opened it, I kept my expression neutral, the kind of neutrality that makes people fill silence with their own guilt. Lila started speaking immediately, trying to take control with urgency, saying she needed to explain, saying she had made mistakes, saying I was being cruel for refusing to talk. Grant stood half a step behind her, hands at his sides, eyes shifting between us like he was looking for the safest exit route. I told Lila she could come in alone, and I said it without raising my voice, because I did not want the hallway to hear us. She hesitated, then tried to argue, then turned to Grant as if seeking confirmation that the rules did not apply to him. Grant did not speak, because he could feel the boundary, and boundaries terrify men who depend on access. Lila finally told him to wait outside, and the annoyance in her tone sounded like intimacy, not dismissal. Grant backed away, jaw tight, and I saw him look once at the doorbell camera, mounted above us, as if he had just realized he had been caught in someone else's frame. Inside, Lila tried to soften again, moving through the same sequence she had used the night before, but her hands were less steady. She said she had been confused, that Grant had been helping her through a difficult year, that she had only brought him because she thought I would be unreasonable otherwise. She tried to frame him as a counselor, a harmless witness, a support system she had been forced to rely on because I had not been there. I listened until she finished. Then I walked to the counter, pulled out my folder and placed it on the table with the kind of care you use when laying down something fragile and expensive. She stared at the folder as if it were a weapon, and in a way it was, but only because it contained her own choices. I opened it slowly and showed her the first page, the merchant alert screenshot with the hotel charge, and I watched her eyes flick away from the timestamp like it was a stain she could not scrub. I turned to the next page, the itinerary update email with 2 guests in the subject line, and she swallowed in a way that was too loud for such a quiet room. Then I showed her the doorbell still frame with her and Grant at my door, the timestamp clean and undeniable. She tried to speak, but the words came out tangled, because lies do not like being pinned down by simple facts. She said the hotel was not what it looked like, that the itinerary was for a work event, that Grant was only helping her find her footing again. She said she did not mean to hurt me, as if meaning mattered more than repetition. I let her talk, because the more she talked, the more she committed herself to explanations that would later collapse. When she paused, I asked her one question, the simplest one that would force the truth to choose a direction, and I asked it in the same tone you use when confirming a patient's date of birth. I asked her whether she wanted to sign the papers today, or whether she wanted me to proceed without her signature and protect my accounts immediately. Her face changed at the word accounts, because she had never treated my trust as valuable, but she treated my access as essential. She leaned forward and tried to grab the folder, but I moved it an inch away, not aggressively, just enough to remind her it was not hers. She accused me of threatening her, and I told her I was not threatening anyone because threats are emotional, and I was dealing in documentation. She stood up abruptly, pacing a short line across the kitchen like she was trying to outrun the evidence. She said she would not be cornered. She said I was trying to punish her. She said I was making her look like a villain. I almost laughed at that last part, because she had spent a year rewriting herself as a free woman, and then returned demanding the benefits of a wife. I told her that the only person making her look like anything was her, and I said it without cruelty, because cruelty is what she expects, and I wanted her to have something worse than cruelty. I wanted her to have clarity. Lila's phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and she flinched, then pulled it out too quickly. I saw the notification banner before she could swipe it away, and it was a shared calendar reminder that popped up because she had forgotten her device was still partially linked to ours. The reminder referenced the same committee session title she had used as cover, and it listed a location that was not a community center, not an office, not a venue anyone could call respectable. It was a boutique hotel lounge, the same hotel from the merchant alert, and the date on the reminder was tonight. She stared at the screen as if it had betrayed her, and I realized in that moment that she was not only lying to me, she had been lying to herself too, using routine and labels to pretend her choices were normal. I watched her mouth open as if to explain, then close again when she realized the explanation would have to fight the words on her own screen. The room felt quiet in a way that was almost spiritual, because silence is what happens when the story breaks and the truth finally steps into the light. I did not raise my voice, and I did not call Grant's name, and I did not even mention the year she had been away. I simply slid the pen across the table again and told her she could either sign the papers as a controlled exit, or she could refuse and watch the exit happen anyway. She looked at the pen like it was a trap, and then she looked up at me with a new expression, not anger, not sadness, but calculation, as if she was trying to decide which lie to sacrifice first. And while she hesitated, my phone vibrated again with another alert, and this one carried a name I did not recognize, but the subject line made my stomach tighten with a cold kind of certainty. The alert was from our apartment leasing office, and the subject line was bland enough to pass unnoticed, but I had learned that bland is how systems hide knives. It said there had been a request to add an occupant, and it listed a name I did not recognize, along with a date for an in-person meeting. My first thought was not jealousy, because jealousy is a luxury, but logistics, because changing an address is how people rewrite a life without asking permission. I looked up from the phone and saw Lila watching my face, trying to read the notification through my eyes. She asked what it was, then immediately corrected herself, pretending she did not care. I did not answer in the way she wanted, because she wanted either outrage or reassurance, and both would give her control. Instead, I turned the phone toward her for half a second, just long enough for her to see the leasing office sender line and the unfamiliar name. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it looked rehearsed, like she had practiced this reaction in private and prayed she would never need it. She reached toward the phone and stopped herself, as if touching it would make the message real. She said the leasing office must be mistaken, and she said it too quickly, like a child denying a broken vase while holding the shards. She claimed she had only asked about renewal options, and she swore she never requested to add anyone. I watched her mouth shape the words and realized she was using the same tone she used in arguments, the tone that says, "You are irrational for noticing facts." It was the tone that used to make me doubt my own memory, until I started writing things down. I told her I was not interested in excuses, because excuses have no timestamps. I opened my ledger again and wrote down the leasing office message subject line and meeting date. I wrote it as a sentence with no emotion, because emotion would let her argue about tone instead of content. She took a step closer and demanded I stop acting like a prosecutor in my own home. I told her I had stopped acting like her husband a long time ago, because she had stopped acting like my wife first. The words landed with a quiet thud, and for a moment I saw something like fear in her eyes, because fear is what happens when manipulation stops working. She pivoted, because pivots are how liars survive. She asked if this was about Grant, and she said his name like it was a test. I did not respond with the satisfaction she expected, because I was not playing her game. I asked her one simple question instead, the kind that collapses a lie by forcing it to choose a shape. I asked her why a leasing office would receive an occupant request with a name she did not recognize. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried again, and each attempt made her look less convincing. Her phone buzzed again, and she tried to hide it with her palm, but hiding is always louder than transparency. She glanced down, and I saw her pupils tighten, as if she had just read something that changed the board. She said she needed to step outside for air, and she said it like a medical claim, as if it was urgent and beyond discussion. I told her she was free to leave, because I was not going to beg for her presence anymore. She froze for half a second, because she had expected me to chase her, and when I did not, the hallway suddenly felt less safe. She walked to the door, and I followed at a distance that said I was not afraid of her, but I was not trusting her either. In the hallway, Grant was still there, standing closer than a stranger would, pretending he was just a concerned friend. When he saw us, he straightened like a man preparing to perform. He asked if everything was okay, and he aimed the question at me like he was trying to establish dominance with courtesy. I did not answer him, because I had learned that some people feed on acknowledgement. Lila stepped toward him and started talking fast, making soft gestures that looked like affection disguised as urgency. I caught fragments as they spilled out, the kind of fragments that tell the truth even when the speaker does not mean them to. She mentioned the leasing office, she mentioned the meeting date, and she said the unfamiliar name out loud, like saying it would exorcise it. Grant's face shifted in a way he could not control, and for a fraction of a second, he looked like a man who had been caught in a story he did not write. That fraction was enough for me to memorize. I went back inside and shut the door gently, because slamming doors is a confession of weakness. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down again, because the table had become a courtroom and I was the only one who still respected evidence. I pulled up our shared account notifications and scrolled through the recent merchant alerts with the patience of someone reading small print. I found a charge that had seemed ordinary at first, a locksmith service call from 2 weeks earlier. It was not a huge amount, but the description included a service location note, and the location was not our address. My breathing stayed steady, but my mind moved faster. A locksmith is not a romantic detail, but it is a practical one, and practical details are how affairs become relocation plans. I took a screenshot of the charge and saved it with the time and date visible. Then I wrote a new line in the ledger that tied the locksmith charge to the leasing office message. The pattern was forming a shape I did not like, because the shape was not only infidelity, but replacement. She was not merely cheating, she was staging a new life while demanding the old one stay available. I heard voices in the hallway again, muffled through the door, and I heard Grant say my name once, like he had earned the right. That was enough to make my jaw tighten, not with rage, but with a cold kind of clarity. I opened the door a crack without stepping out, just enough to make it clear I was present, not enough to invite them in. Grant started speaking in a smooth, practiced tone, the kind of tone used by men who believe charm is a legal defense. He claimed he was there because Lila was upset, and he suggested we should talk like adults. I told him calmly that the only adult move was to leave my doorway immediately. Lila snapped that I was being humiliating, and she said it like humiliation was something I inflicted, not something she had cultivated. She demanded I apologize to Grant for treating him like he was nothing. The phrase landed in the air like a dare, and I felt the universe give me a clean line to walk. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because a smile is sometimes the sharpest boundary. I told her not to forget to sign the papers. Her head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a sound it does not understand. She asked what papers, and her voice broke on the last word in a way that surprised her. Grant went still because men like him recognize paper as danger. I stepped back inside, opened the folder again, and pulled out the top document without theatrics. I did not wave it around. I just held it in a way that made the header visible. It was a separation agreement draft, not filed yet, but prepared, dated, and ready. Lila's eyes fixed on the date, and I watched her mind try to rewrite time. She asked how long I had been planning this, and she said it like my preparation was betrayal. I told her I started planning the day she left, because abandoning a marriage is not a vacation. Grant tried to speak, but I lifted a hand slightly, not aggressive, just final. I told him he was not a party to this and that his presence was already documented by my doorbell camera. That last part made his lips press together because he understood documentation, even if he pretended not to. Lila tried a new angle, because she always had a new angle. She said the agreement was unfair, and she claimed I was trying to take everything. I told her the agreement was a starting point, not a verdict, and that her signature would make it faster and quieter. I explained that if she refused, the process would still happen, and it would happen in places with witnesses, schedules, and records. She asked if I was threatening to ruin her, and she looked for outrage in my face so she could claim victimhood. I told her I was not ruining anyone, because truth is not sabotage. The hallway felt narrower now, as if the building itself had leaned in to listen. Grant shifted his weight and glanced down the corridor, as if considering escape. Lila looked at him, and in that look I saw the real relationship. Not support, not friendship, but strategy. She wanted him there as muscle, not physical muscle, but narrative muscle, someone who could later claim I was unstable and she was terrified. I knew that play, and I knew the only way to beat it was to stay calmer than the lie. I asked her, directly, whether she had requested to add an occupant to our lease. She denied it, and the denial was crisp. I asked her directly whether she had used my account for a locksmith at a different address. She blinked twice, and the denial that followed was slower. I asked her directly why the itinerary email said 2 guests, and she said it was a system error. I let each answer hang, because hanging answers are how people start hearing themselves. Grant took a half step forward and said we could all sit down and work this out. I told him, in the same tone, that there would be no sitting down with him involved. Then I turned to Lila and said she could either come in alone and discuss terms, or she could leave and receive all future communications through certified mail. The words certified mail changed her posture, because it meant the game was moving into records. She looked at the separation agreement again, and her mouth moved like she was tasting bitterness. Finally, she demanded a private talk, and she said it with that same authority she used in public, the authority she had borrowed from other people's respect. I agreed, but only after Grant stepped away and turned his back, making a show of being polite. Lila came inside and shut the door behind her, and for a moment her confidence wavered without an audience. She asked if I really wanted to end us, and she tried to make it sound like romance, not consequences. I told her the ending had already happened, and I was only filing the paperwork. She stared at me with a new kind of panic, because she realized she had miscalculated the timeline. She had assumed she could return, demand obedience, and keep her new life in the shadows until it was ready. She had assumed I would be grateful for scraps, because gratitude is what she trained me to show. She did not understand that a year away had taught me something simple and permanent. The absence had cured me of bargaining. I placed the pen on the table again and told her to read the signature line. She picked up the pen, then set it down, then picked it up again, like it burned. She asked what I would do if she did not sign, and I told her I would proceed, calmly, with every documented proof I had, and I would protect my accounts immediately. Her eyes narrowed, and she said that was financial abuse, using the language she had learned from people who weaponize therapy words. I told her protecting my accounts from unauthorized charges was not abuse, and the fact she called it that was evidence of intent. Her face hardened, and she said she would fight me, and she would make me regret it. I nodded once, because threats are predictable. Then I slid one more page from the folder, not the whole ledger, not the doorbell stills, but a single printed screenshot from the leasing office email chain. It showed the meeting date and the unfamiliar name, and at the bottom, it showed that the request had been sent from her email address. She stared at it, and the room went silent in the exact way a lie goes silent when it finally sees a mirror. She whispered that she could explain, but she did not start explaining, because explanations require a believable path. I watched her shoulders rise and fall, and I realized the next move would not be emotional, but strategic. She would either try to sign and bargain, or refuse and run to build a story about me before I could act. I had anticipated that, and I had prepared my next steps accordingly. Still, the moment she reached for her phone, I felt the stakes climb again, because whatever she sent next would decide who controlled the narrative outside this room. My hand moved before my thoughts finished forming, and I placed my palm over her phone like I was stopping a spill, not starting a fight. I did not grab, I did not twist, and I did not raise my voice, because any physical contest would become her favorite kind of story. I simply held the moment still, long enough for her to understand that I saw the trigger she was about to pull. Lila stared at my hand with a sharp, offended calm, as if I had violated her basic rights by refusing to be edited in real time. I told her she could use the phone, but she would do it after she left my apartment, and she would do it without my name in her mouth. She tried to laugh, and the laugh failed halfway, because fear always leaks through comedy. She asked if I was controlling her, and she used that tired word like a shield, hoping it would make me step back out of guilt. I told her I was controlling my doorway, my accounts, and my record, because those were the only three things she had not already tried to rewrite. She called me paranoid, then she called me cold, then she called me cruel, and each label sounded like a tool dropped on a hard floor. The moment she realized none of them worked, her eyes sharpened into calculation again. She said she needed to call her mother, and she said it with a tremble that was almost convincing. I told her she could call whoever she wanted, but she would not do it while sitting at my kitchen table like a guest demanding hospitality. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped, and the sound felt like punctuation. She moved toward the door, and I stayed where I was, because chasing is what men do when they want forgiveness. I wanted documentation, and documentation requires distance, not pleading. When she opened the door, Grant was still in the hall, pretending he had been looking at his shoes for 10 minutes. He lifted his head with a practiced expression that said he was here to help, even though his presence was the problem. Lila stepped into the hallway, and her shoulders dropped into a smaller posture, the posture she used when she wanted men to protect her. She started speaking fast, and she turned her body so that I could not see her phone screen, only her thumb moving. The performance was for him, not for me, and that fact did not hurt anymore, because pain requires hope. I closed the door gently and turned the deadbolt, because a deadbolt is not hostility, it is clarity. I walked back to the table and opened my folder again. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the shared email inbox we still had for bills. I did not need to hack anything, because people like Lila assume the boring places are safe. I searched for the leasing office thread, and I found it in seconds because the subject line was still there, waiting like a cigarette burn. The request had been sent from her address, and it included a phone number attached to the unknown name. I wrote the phone number down by hand, then I wrote the date and time of the email, and then I wrote the phrase she had used earlier about renewal options. I did it slowly, because slow writing is how you tell yourself the truth is real. My breathing stayed even, but my mind ran in lanes I understood, because I had built a career around noticing how small inconsistencies become big losses. I used to do insurance claims, the kind with water damage and missing jewelry, where everyone swears the timeline is simple until you ask them to repeat it twice. Lila's timeline was already cracking, and she had not even reached the difficult questions yet. My phone vibrated again, and this time it was a merchant alert from my bank. It was a small charge, but it came from a printing shop, and the description included a store location across town. Lila did not use print shops because she hated paper that could not be deleted. I opened the alert and stared at it until the meaning sharpened into focus. A print shop is where you make forms look official, where you make envelopes look important, and where you turn a lie into something that can be handed to strangers. I took a screenshot of the merchant alert with the time visible. Then I printed it on my own printer and signed the back, because signatures are how you anchor memory to ink. I placed it into a clear sleeve and wrote the date label on the corner, then I slid it into the folder like a card into a deck. I could already imagine what she had printed, because she had always loved preemptive narratives. She was the kind of woman who would write a story about my temper before she provoked it, then point to the story as proof. I stood up and walked to the entry closet where we kept spare keys, old mail, and forgotten junk. I did not tear the place apart, because tearing looks guilty, but I opened the small box where we kept lease documents and building notices. Inside, I found something that did not belong there. A thin envelope with the leasing office logo, unsealed, with my name typed incorrectly by one letter. The mistake was the kind a person makes when they copy a name from memory instead of a document. I photographed the envelope beside today's newspaper on my phone, and I felt my stomach drop into a colder place. The letter inside was a formal warning about a disturbance complaint tied to my unit, with a date that matched a night I had been alone. It claimed a neighbor reported shouting and threats in the hallway, and it suggested the building would escalate if it happened again. The language was careful, which made it more dangerous, because careful language becomes policy. I looked at the signature line, and I recognized the property manager's name from past maintenance emails. It was real enough to hurt me, but not real enough to be honest. I took a photo of the letter in full, then I scanned it into a PDF and saved it with the file name starting with the date. I did not panic, because panic feeds complaints, but I felt a dull anger that tasted like metal. This was not just a marriage ending, this was a setup, and the setup was bigger than Grant's smug face. I sat down again and wrote a new section header in my ledger. Then I listed the disturbance letter as its own evidence item, because the moment a system creates a record, you either respect it or it crushes you. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Lila, a single sentence asking if we could talk calmly. I did not respond, because calm talk is what she asked for right before she changed the subject. A minute later, another message arrived, and this one said she was scared of me, and she asked me not to lock her out. The shift was so fast, it would have been funny in a different life. I took screenshots of both messages and placed them into a separate folder on my phone labeled with the day's date. I knew what was happening because I had seen it before in other people's disasters. She was building a contradiction on purpose, first offering peace, then claiming fear, so that whatever I did next could be framed as proof. If I replied warmly, she would say I was manipulating her, and if I replied coldly, she would say I was threatening her. So, I did the only thing she could not twist without looking obvious. I responded with a single line, telling her that future communication would be by email, and that she could retrieve any personal items tomorrow with a neutral witness present. The word witness changed the air even through a screen, because witnesses are kryptonite to narrative control. I could almost hear her teeth grind as she read it. She replied immediately, asking what I meant by papers and whether I had already filed something. I did not answer that either, because fear makes people careless, and careless makes evidence. Instead, I opened the courthouse website and looked up the requirements for a legal separation filing in our county, making sure I stayed inside what was public and lawful. I did not need speed, I needed clean steps. I booked a consultation with a mediator for later that week, and I saved the appointment confirmation email with headers visible. Then I requested an account separation appointment with my bank, not to punish her, but to stop her from using my name as a wallet. I knew she would call it abuse, because she calls any boundary abuse, but the bank would call it risk management. I saved the bank appointment confirmation too, because the date would matter later when she claimed she had no warning. That evening, my sister called, and her voice carried a careful tension that told me she had already spoken to Lila. She said Lila was telling people I had changed, that I was unstable, that I was threatening to ruin her life over an old misunderstanding. I listened without interrupting, because interruptions turn you into the villain in someone else's summary. When my sister finished, I thanked her and asked one question, the only question that matters when rumors start. I asked her what exactly Lila said happened in the hallway and who she claimed witnessed it. My sister hesitated, then said Lila claimed a neighbor heard me shouting, and she mentioned a complaint letter from the building. I felt my throat tighten, but not from sadness, from confirmation. Lila had seeded the complaint letter as a prop in her story, and she had distributed the story before I could show the letter was suspicious. I told my sister I was fine, then I told her I had documentation that the complaint was part of a pattern. I asked her not to argue with Lila and not to spread anything, because the truth would be stronger when it arrived as a complete packet. After the call, I walked to my door and opened it, not to chase anyone, but to listen. The hallway was quiet, but I could hear distant movement, and I could smell a faint cologne that I recognized from Grant. That smell told me he had been near my door recently, close enough to be part of whatever complaint narrative was forming. I did not confront, because confrontation without proof is entertainment for liars. I closed the door again, then I opened my doorbell camera app and scrolled through the still frames, not searching for drama, searching for timestamps. There it was, a still frame from earlier, Grant standing outside my door while Lila texted, his posture angled toward the peephole like he was checking whether I was watching. The timestamp was precise, and the posture was incriminating in a quiet way. I saved the still frame, then I printed it and signed the back because I was done trusting digital memory alone. I added it to the folder behind the complaint letter because the two items belonged together like cause and effect. Later that night, I heard a knock, soft, hesitant, the knock of someone trying to look harmless. I did not open the door, because opening the door would be an invitation to a scene. Instead, I spoke through it, asking who it was, and a familiar voice answered from the other side, the property manager. He said he wanted to check on things after a complaint, and his tone was friendly enough to be dangerous. I told him I was fine. Then I told him I wanted all future communication in writing. There was a pause, and in that pause I heard the shift from neighborly to bureaucratic. He said he could email me the details, and he said he hoped we could resolve it peacefully. I agreed, and I said I would respond after reviewing the record. When he walked away, I heard a second set of footsteps a few seconds later, lighter, quicker, like someone stepping back into a shadow. I did not need to see Lila to know she was nearby, because she always liked to stand close to the story she was writing. I went back to the table and stared at my evidence folder, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself one honest feeling. It was not heartbreak, because heartbreak belongs to love, and love had been rationed here for too long. It was a grim kind of relief, the relief of finally seeing the mechanism clearly. She was not returning because she missed me. She was returning because she needed the stability of my life to support the chaos of hers. She wanted me to apologize to her ex because it would prove she still owned my spine. I opened the separation agreement again and reread the clauses I had drafted. Then I made 2 changes that tightened the timeline. I added a clause about exclusive occupancy until the lease matter was resolved, and I added a clause about joint accounts and discretionary spending, because money is how people keep leverage while pretending they want peace. Then I placed the papers back into the folder and pushed the folder to the center of the table like a quiet altar. Tomorrow would bring witnesses, appointments, and public rooms where lies feel less powerful. My phone buzzed once more, and this time it was a new email from the leasing office, confirming the occupant meeting and asking me to attend as the primary leaseholder. The email listed the unknown name again, and next to it, in a smaller line, it listed a second contact number. It was Grant's number, and the confirmation sat there like a loaded gun with a receipt attached. I stared at the email until the screen felt like it was staring back, because nothing sobers a man faster than seeing an enemy's name attached to his home. The leasing office had copied me as the primary leaseholder, then casually included Grant as if he belonged on the thread, and the worst part was how normal it looked. I read the message 3 times, not to understand it, but to measure how far they were willing to go with paperwork. Then I forwarded it to a new folder in my inbox, saved the full headers, and printed the page so the date and routing were trapped on paper. The next move was obvious, but I still paused, because obvious moves are where people get baited. If I replied in anger, Lila would claim I was unstable. If I replied with threats, she would turn the threats into the story she had been preparing. So I wrote 1 sentence in a clean tone, asking the leasing office to confirm why a non-tenant contact was included, and I requested that all third-party communication be removed from the thread. I added 1 more sentence, stating that any meeting would require a written agenda and a record of the original complaint submission. I did not accuse anyone, because accusations create fog, but requests create trails. When I hit send, my hands did not shake, which surprised me, because I expected the old desperation to show up like a reflex. A year ago, I would have chased her for clarity, begged her for a reason, tried to bargain with the parts of her that never negotiated in good faith. Now I felt something else, a calm mechanical focus, the kind you get when you finally accept the building is on fire and your job is to map the exits. I opened my evidence folder and added a new entry, writing the lease email as a timeline anchor and linking it to the disturbance letter. I wrote Grant's number beside it and circled it, not because I intended to call, but because circles are how you mark a target without saying the word. I slept in short bursts because the mind refuses to rest when it senses a legal trap. By morning, I had drafted a simple 1-page table with dates, locations, and the proof attached to each. It was not dramatic, and it was not emotional, because drama is a liar's currency. I stapled the pages in chronological order and placed them in a clear sleeve. Then I photographed the sleeve beside my wall clock so time itself became a witness. The method was boring on purpose, because boring survives scrutiny. At noon, my bank appointment came first, and I arrived early because punctuality makes a person look credible. The teller who met me had a careful smile and tired eyes, the kind of face that has seen every version of marital panic. I explained that I needed to separate discretionary spending on the joint account while keeping essential bills paid, and I kept my voice even, because emotion makes people suspicious. She asked routine questions, then printed a transaction summary that showed the recent print shop charge. I asked for a stamped copy of the summary, and when she handed it over, the stamp felt like a small piece of armor. Outside the bank, my phone buzzed with another message from Lila, and this time it was a longer one, full of soft language and manufactured regret. She wrote that she loved me, that she was ready to come home, that Grant had only been helping her after a hard year. She ended with the same demand, insisting I apologize to him for being rude, because she said I embarrassed her. I read it once, then took a screenshot, then I saved it without replying, because silence is the only reply that cannot be edited. I added the message to my ledger as a pattern item, marking it as emotional pressure paired with a public loyalty demand. The mediator's office was across town, a small suite with beige walls and brochures that promised peace without mentioning the price. The mediator, a woman named Diane, greeted me with a calm professional neutrality that made me trust her more than any warm smile could. I told her I wanted a separation agreement structured around timelines and documented behavior, and I told her I wanted communications routed in writing. I did not ask her to punish anyone, because punishment makes people defensive, but structure makes them confess. Diane nodded, then asked whether there were any concerns about housing stability and lease control. I handed her the printed lease email and the disturbance letter, and I watched her eyes narrow slightly as she read. She did not react dramatically, but the way she held the paper changed, as if it weighed more than it should. She said the inclusion of a non-tenant contact was unusual, and she said the complaint letter looked like a step toward leverage. She explained the civil options in simple terms, including how a separation filing could formalize occupancy expectations and reduce the room for ambush. I asked what could realistically happen within 30 days, and her answer was precise enough to feel safe. When I left the mediator's office, I felt the first real shift of the week, because I no longer felt like I was merely reacting. I had a schedule now, dates on record, and a professional who had seen enough lies to recognize the smell. I saved the mediation appointment confirmation and printed it. Then I signed the back, because the habit was becoming ritual. In the parking lot, I noticed a car idling near the exit, a dark sedan with tinted windows, and I recognized the way it waited without looking like it waited. I did not approach, because approaching is how you give a watcher a scene to report, but I photographed the license plate from a distance and wrote the time down in my notes. Back at the apartment, I found a new envelope taped to my door, again from the leasing office, and again unsealed. It was a notice for an occupant verification meeting scheduled for Friday morning, and it requested that I bring identification and the original lease documents. At the bottom, in smaller text, it stated that all listed occupants should attend, as if the building had already accepted a new reality. My jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the insult of it. They were trying to treat my life like a spreadsheet that could be updated with the right persuasion. I took photos of the notice in place, then I removed it and photographed it beside the day's mail. I opened my email and saw the leasing office had replied to my earlier message, claiming Grant was included as a designated contact provided by my spouse. That one sentence clarified everything, because it proved Lila had used the building's process to insert her ex into my housing record. I forwarded the reply to Diane, then I saved it as a PDF with the headers visible, then I printed it and placed it behind the bank stamp. The sequence was becoming a spine of its own, a chain of paper that could not be denied without sounding foolish. That evening, my sister came over with a tight expression, and she did not even step fully inside before she asked if I had done something to Lila. She said Lila told her I was refusing to let her come back, that I was threatening to throw her things away, and that I was plotting something cruel. I told my sister I had offered a safe pickup time with a neutral witness, and I showed her the message on my phone. Then, I showed her the leasing office email, with Grant copied, and I watched the color drain from her face. She did not apologize, but her posture changed, because the mind respects proof even when the heart wants a softer story. My sister said Lila was spiraling, calling relatives, asking them to shame me into compliance. She said Lila kept repeating the word apologize like a prayer, as if the apology itself would restore the old hierarchy. I told my sister I would not apologize to a man who was trying to become an occupant in my home through administrative trickery. I also told her I was not trying to destroy Lila, but I was refusing to be destroyed quietly. My sister asked what papers I meant, and for the first time I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. I told her the papers were real, and the papers were the only language Lila could not talk over. The next day, I arranged the item pickup for noon, and I asked my neighbor, an older man named Paul, to be present in the hallway as a neutral witness. Paul was not a friend, which made him perfect, because friends have motives, but neighbors have routines. When noon came, Lila arrived with Grant beside her, and the sight of them together in my hallway felt like watching a crime scene assemble itself. Lila tried to step inside as if she still owned the threshold, and I blocked her with my body without touching her, because touch is what she wanted. I told her Paul was present as a witness, and her eyes flicked toward him with irritation she could not hide. Grant tried to speak, and I cut him off with a simple instruction, telling him to stay in the hall and stop pretending he belonged here. Lila demanded I apologize to him in front of Paul, as if she believed public pressure could override common sense. I told her calmly that I would not apologize, and that I was documenting every attempt to force compliance through humiliation. Then I handed her a small box of her personal items I had already packed, and I told her anything else would be retrieved after the lease situation was resolved. Lila's face tightened into a brittle smile, and she said she would handle the lease herself. Paul cleared his throat and asked politely why Grant was involved in the lease at all. Lila froze for half a second, the way people freeze when they forget they are not alone. She said Grant was only a contact because she had been helping with administrative things during the year away. Paul nodded slowly, and the slow nod looked like disbelief. I watched Grant's jaw shift, and I could tell he wanted to interrupt, but he didn't, because witnesses make bullies cautious. I took a photo of the boxes in the hall, not because boxes are evidence, but because timestamps always are. After they left, Paul told me, in a low voice, that he had seen Lila and Grant together twice in the last month near the building, both times late, both times acting like they were checking who was around. He said he did not want to get involved, but he did not like being used as background for someone else's mess. I thanked him and asked him for one sentence summary with the date and time he remembered, and he agreed. I wrote it down in front of him and asked him to sign the paper, and he did, because honest people understand signatures. That night, another email arrived from the leasing office, stating that the Friday meeting would include the property manager and designated contacts for all parties. The message ended with a line about maintaining a safe environment for residents, which sounded like a polite accusation. I saved it, printed it, and placed it on top of my folder like a warning label. Then I opened my laptop and drafted a short, factual reply requesting that the meeting be documented, that no third party be present without written justification, and that any safety-related claims be supported by the original report details. I sent the email, then I turned off my phone for 10 minutes, because even a calm man needs a pause. When I turned the phone back on, I saw Lila had posted something vague on social media, a story about surviving a controlling relationship, with a sad song attached. She had not named me, but the implication was clear, and she had tagged the neighborhood location like she wanted people to connect dots. I took a screenshot, saved it with the date stamp, and added it to my ledger under reputation pressure. I did not panic, because vague posts are weak evidence, but they are strong bait, and bait is only dangerous when you bite. I sat at my table and looked at the growing stack of documents, and I realized what this had become. Lila was not just fighting for a marriage comeback, she was fighting for control of the narrative that would explain her year away without making her look reckless. Grant was not just an ex. He was a lever she was trying to install into my life, a man-shaped wedge meant to split my stability until she could walk back in as the victim who had been forced to leave. The lease meeting on Friday was not a routine administrative check, and it was not about safety. It was a stage, and they had already started arranging the props. I closed my folder, set it beside the door where I could grab it easily, and I wrote one final line in my ledger before bed. I wrote that the next confrontation would be public, it would be procedural, and it would be documented in a way they could not erase. Then I stared at the calendar, at the Friday meeting time, and I felt the shape of the trap clearly enough to step around it. What I did not know yet was which of them would crack first when the record stopped being theirs. By Thursday morning, the apartment felt less like a home and more like a file cabinet that happened to have a bed. Every surface held proof of something, and I had stopped seeing objects as objects because everything had turned into potential context. A stapled receipt was not a receipt anymore. It was a timestamp with a motive attached. An email header was not a header. It was a path through servers that showed who started the fire. I made coffee and did not taste it, because my body had shifted into a narrow kind of efficiency, the kind you get when you know the next day will try to break you in public. I took the leasing office notice and read it again, not because it contained new information, but because repetition exposes intent. They kept using the word safe like a weapon, and it was obvious they wanted to place me inside that word as the threat. If the meeting went the way they hoped, the property manager would frame the situation as a community concern, then they would introduce Grant as a reasonable party who just wanted stability for Lila. I could already see the posture they would adopt, the sympathetic faces, the pre-written conclusions, and I understood what Lila was doing with the apology demand. She needed me on record as the rude husband, because a rude husband is easier to evict than a careful one. I spent the late morning preparing a folder that was deliberately boring, because boring evidence is the kind that makes liars sweat. I printed the lease email thread with the line about Grant being a designated contact, and I placed it behind the disturbance letter so the story began with their action, not my reaction. I included the bank transaction summary showing the print shop charge, and I attached my stamped copy, because a stamp from an institution changes how people speak. I added Paul's signed sentence summary and my photos of the notices taped to my door, and I labeled each page with the date in the top right corner like it was a court exhibit. I was not trying to win a war with emotion, I was trying to win a small battle with paperwork. The separation papers sat in a different sleeve, and I touched that sleeve last because it had gravity. They were not a bluff, and they were not a threat I invented to look strong. Weeks ago, after Lila's first message demanding I apologize to Grant, I had met with a mediator and drafted terms that treated our marriage like a contract that had been repeatedly breached. The papers were clean, civil, and designed to stop the kind of ambush she was attempting now. They controlled communication, they defined occupancy expectations, and they created consequences that did not require anyone to believe rumors. I had not served anything yet, because I had been waiting for a moment where timing mattered more than shock. That afternoon, I walked to the building's mailroom and found two women from the third floor reading their phones and whispering with a familiarity that always grows around scandal. They glanced at me and went quiet, and I could feel the air thicken with the kind of judgment that forms before facts arrive. I did not confront them because confrontations without proof are charity for gossip. Instead, I nodded once, checked my box, and found another printed notice from the leasing office about Friday's occupant verification. The notice was identical to the one taped to my door, which meant they wanted redundancy, and redundancy is how an accusation becomes normalized. I photographed it in my hand, then I photographed the date stamp on the envelope, then I slid it into my folder without changing my expression. Back upstairs, my phone lit up with another message from Lila, and it was written in the same softened tone she used when she wanted something to look like her idea. She said she had spoken to the property manager to calm everything down. She said the meeting was routine, and she said Grant was only attending to support her. Then she repeated the demand, again insisting I apologize to him before the meeting so we could present a united front. There was a cruelty in that phrase that she probably did not even notice, because the united front she wanted was me standing behind her while she replaced me quietly. I took a screenshot, saved it, and added it to the ledger as an escalation attempt. I called Diane, not to ask for rescue, but to align my next move with reality. She did not tell me what to do because professionals rarely do, but she asked the right questions in a calm sequence. She asked whether I had requested removal of Grant from the leasing communications, and she asked whether I had proof of Lila inserting him as a contact. She asked whether I had reason to believe the property manager was acting beyond policy. When I told her about the repeated safety language and the redundant notices, her tone shifted slightly, just enough to show concern without melodrama. She told me to keep Friday procedural, keep it documented, and keep my outcomes limited to what the evidence could support. She also reminded me that if the meeting turned into a pressure performance, I could end it by asking one policy-based question and then leaving. That night, I barely slept, and the lack of sleep made everything feel sharper, like the world had turned into a set of edges. Around 2 a.m, my doorbell camera sent an alert, and I saw 2 silhouettes in the hallway standing too close to my door for too long. They did not knock, and they did not try the handle, but one of them leaned toward the peephole as if checking whether I was awake. I did not open the door, because opening the door is how you turn an intimidation attempt into a story about conflict. I saved the still frame with the timestamp visible and wrote the time down in my notes. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and realized the situation had crossed into a different category. They were no longer trying to win socially. They were trying to unsettle my sense of safety inside my own space. By morning, I had decided that Friday would not be a negotiation, and it would not be a scene. It would be a record. I printed one more copy of my evidence ledger and placed it in a clear sleeve, because the sleeve made it look official, without claiming it was. I wrote a short agenda for myself in simple language, not because I needed structure, but because structure is how you avoid being provoked into improvisation. I also wrote one sentence on a blank page, a sentence I could read in my head if the room tried to tilt. It was a reminder that I was not there to defend my character, because character arguments are endless. I was there to confirm facts and then leave. Before noon, my sister called again, and her voice sounded strained, like she was being pulled between loyalties she did not choose. She said Lila had told the family I was refusing to let her retrieve her things, and she said Lila had hinted that I was emotionally abusive. My sister did not say she believed it, but she did not say she didn't, and the ambiguity hurt more than disbelief. I told her I had offered a pickup with a neutral witness, and that Lila brought Grant to the hallway on purpose. I told her I had documentation of the lease manipulation and the repeated public apology demand. My sister went quiet, then asked why Lila would do something so risky if she wanted to come back. The question landed cleanly, and I answered it honestly. I said Lila did not want to come back as my wife. She wanted to come back as the person who set the terms. That afternoon, I received a short email from the leasing office confirming the meeting time again, and this time it included a line stating that the property manager had authority to adjust occupancy status based on safety considerations. The sentence was written like policy, but it read like a threat. and I felt anger rise in my chest in a hot wave that demanded action. I did not act on the heat. I waited until the heat cooled. Then I replied with a single request asking them to cite the specific policy section that authorized such adjustments, and to confirm whether the meeting would be documented by minutes. I attached nothing, because attachments invite counter-arguments, and I wanted them to answer in writing without distraction. Their reply came an hour later, short and evasive, refusing to cite policy and ignoring the minutes question entirely. That was the moment I understood the property manager was not simply being cautious. He was playing a role. Maybe he was lazy, maybe he was compromised, or maybe he simply liked the power of being the person who decided who belonged. Whatever the reason, he was not acting like a neutral administrator, and neutrality was the only thing that protected residents from abuse. I forwarded the email chain to Diane and labeled it as a procedural refusal. Then, I opened my separation papers sleeve and stared at the signature lines like they were a doorway. If I waited longer, Lila would control the narrative first. If I moved too fast, she would claim I was retaliating. Timing was everything, and she had been trying to force me into reactive timing all week. In the early evening, Lila appeared outside my building without warning, and I saw her through the lobby glass, standing with Grant like they were arriving for a dinner reservation. She looked polished in a way that felt strategic, and Grant wore the confident patience of a man who believes he is already inside the outcome. Lila did not have to speak to communicate the demand, because her posture was the demand. She wanted me to come down, to engage, to give the lobby a show. I stayed upstairs because the lobby was not my arena, and I did not owe her a scene. A few minutes later, my phone rang, and she left a voice message that was heavy with forced sadness, describing herself as humiliated and abandoned. I saved the timestamp screenshot of the voicemail screen, then I deleted nothing, because deletion is what guilty people do. After they left, I sat at my table and looked at everything I had collected, and I felt something close to relief because the proof had become large enough to carry itself. The week had been designed to make me look reactive, but I had stayed procedural, and procedure leaves fingerprints. I pulled out the separation papers, signed my own sections with steady hands, and placed them back into the sleeve. I did not serve them yet, because the serve was the knife, and a knife only matters if you place it at the right moment. Friday's meeting was the moment they wanted to use to label me, and I would not let them label me without consequences. I packed my folder, my sleeves, and a spare copy of my evidence ledger into a plain bag that looked like it held nothing important. I set the bag by the door and checked my phone battery, because a dead phone is a liar's dream. Then I stood in the quiet of my apartment and listened, not for footsteps, but for the feeling of being watched. I could not hear anything, but I could feel the pressure of what was coming, like weather in the bones. Before bed, I wrote one final note in my ledger, and the note was not emotional. I wrote that if Lila demanded an apology again at the meeting, I would not argue, I would not plead. I would smile, and I would ask for one thing in writing, and then I would place the papers on the table like a calm object. I did not know how the property manager would react, or how Grant would try to spin it, but I knew Lila's face would change, because she believed the future was still negotiable. The only question left was who would be standing next to her when she realized it wasn't. Friday arrived with the kind of pale winter light that makes every hallway look like a confession booth, and I woke before my alarm because my body had already decided the day was an exam. I moved through my apartment with quiet intent, checking my folder twice, confirming the sleeves were ordered to tell the story without me forcing it, and making sure my phone was charged because nothing collapses faster than a plan that depends on memory. The bag by the door looked ordinary, which mattered, because ordinary objects disarm people who expect drama, and I wanted them to underestimate how prepared I was. I ate a small breakfast that tasted like cardboard, and I forced myself to drink water because dehydration turns patience into irritability, and irritability was exactly the crack they wanted to exploit. When I stepped into the hall, I noticed a faint scuff on the paint near my doorframe, as if someone had leaned there too long, and I felt the old instinct to investigate surge up. I didn't kneel down or stare at it, because even the act of looking can be performed as paranoia when someone is building a narrative about you. Instead, I walked to the elevator with the bag at my side and my shoulders loose, the way men look when they have nothing to hide, and I watched my own reflection in the metal panel as if it belonged to a stranger. In the mirror, I looked calm, which was a useful disguise, because calm makes people careless, and careless people say things they can't retract later. The lobby was busier than usual, and that was the first tell that this meeting had been preloaded with witnesses. The leasing office door stood open like a stage entrance, and two residents I recognized from the mailroom lingered near the package shelves, pretending to check labels while their eyes tracked me. The doorman sat behind the desk with a magazine open, but he wasn't reading, and I registered his attention the way you register a camera lens, not hostile, but awake. Near the glass doors, Grant leaned against a column with the lazy confidence of someone who expects others to move around him, and Lila stood beside him in a coat that looked newly chosen, her hair shaped into the kind of controlled softness that photographs well. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and I understood she had rehearsed that expression to look like the reasonable party in a disagreement. I didn't approach them, because approaching them would have turned the lobby into a negotiation zone, and I refused to let them choose the terrain. I walked straight to the leasing office, greeted the receptionist with a polite nod, and asked where the property manager wanted us to sit. My voice sounded steady, and I felt something in the room shift, because people always brace for conflict when they see a couple, and a third person standing too close, and my refusal to perform made the moment feel strange. The receptionist pointed toward a conference room with a thin glass wall, and I noticed a small sign on the door that read, "Resident Review Meeting," as if they were trying to sanitize the threat with bureaucratic language. Inside the room, the property manager, Dean, sat at the head of the table with a laptop open and a notepad placed beside it like a prop. Dean was in his 40s, clean-shaven, careful with his posture, and he had the kind of polite smile that stays fixed even when the room catches fire. He gestured for everyone to sit, and I chose a seat that gave me a clear view of the door and the glass wall, not because I expected violence, but because I wanted to see who was watching. Lila sat across from me with Grant beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and Dean placed himself in the center like he was hosting a family discussion instead of managing a property dispute. I set my bag on the table, zipped closed, and folded my hands because hands tell the truth when mouths lie. Dean began with a speech about community standards, safety concerns, and the importance of respectful conduct, and he delivered it like he had delivered it before, perhaps to other residents who were easier to intimidate. He referenced anonymous complaints, recent disturbances, and a need for clarity on occupancy, and I watched how his eyes moved when he spoke, because eyes drift toward power without meaning to. Every time he mentioned safety, his gaze slid toward Lila and Grant for a beat, as if checking whether they approved, and that one detail told me this meeting had an audience of exactly two. Lila nodded at the right moments, almost imperceptibly, as if she was co-signing his statements, and Grant sat with his hands clasped, projecting patience like a man waiting for his reward. When Dean finished his opening, Lila leaned forward and began describing our situation in a voice that sounded practiced, and she framed it as a marriage conflict that had spilled into the building. She described me as withdrawn, stubborn, and unwilling to cooperate, and she implied that my refusal to apologize had escalated tensions in shared spaces. She did not mention the year she spent away, and she did not mention that she was the one who brought Grant into our home boundary like a crowbar. She spoke in generalities because generalities are hard to disprove in real time, and I let her speak without interruption, because interruptions make you look defensive. Grant added a few measured comments about wanting peace, supporting Lila, and ensuring the building remained calm, and he used the word support the way some men use ownership, quiet, confident, and unchallenged. Dean then turned to me and asked for my perspective, and the room went still in the way rooms do when they expect a man to explode. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't attack anyone's character, because anger is the fuel they were hoping I would supply. I thanked Dean for scheduling the meeting and said I wanted to keep the conversation factual and policy-based, because policy is a language liars hate. Then I asked one simple question, whether this meeting would be documented with minutes or a written summary, and whether any decision about occupancy would be tied to a specific lease clause. Dean's smile tightened slightly, and he said they didn't usually issue minutes for informal meetings, and I nodded as if that was fine, because it didn't need to be a fight to be a record. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sleeve, not the whole folder, because dumping evidence all at once looks theatrical, and I wanted it to look inevitable. I slid the printed email thread across the table toward Dean, with the line highlighted that listed Grant as a designated contact for leasing communications. I didn't accuse anyone yet, and I didn't attach motive, because motive arguments create noise. I simply asked Dean to explain when and why Grant had been added as a contact, given that he was not a leaseholder, not a resident, and not an authorized proxy from me. Lila's posture changed before her face did, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the way people grip surfaces when their internal script starts failing. Dean glanced at the paper, then glanced at Lila, and that reflexive glance was an answer without words. Lila tried to pivot, saying she had only shared information so the building could communicate effectively, and she implied she was acting in good faith for everyone's comfort. Grant remained still, but his eyes sharpened, and I could see him calculating the room in a new way, less confident, more guarded. I asked Dean whether the building had a policy for adding third-party contacts to a tenant's account, and I asked whether written consent from both leaseholders was required, because I already knew the answer from the lease handbook I had requested earlier. Dean's voice stayed polite, but his phrasing became slippery, and he said the building could accept updates from a primary resident when safety was involved, which was a nice-sounding phrase that meant nothing without a clause. I followed with a second question, calm and precise, asking him to cite the exact lease section that allowed it, because I wanted the refusal, not the citation. Dean didn't cite anything, and he tried to redirect toward behavior concerns again, but now the air felt different, because my evidence had shifted the meeting from feelings to procedure. I placed the second sleeve on the table, the bank transaction summary showing the print shop charge, and I explained that building notices had been printed and posted repeatedly, and that the pattern suggested coordination rather than spontaneous concern. I did not claim Lila printed them because claims without receipts are weak, and I didn't need to win by guessing. I simply showed that the building's process had turned unusually aggressive and unusually redundant in the same week a third party was inserted into my account. The connection did not need to be screamed, because intelligent rooms connect dots when they are allowed to. Lila then attempted her favorite lever, the apology demand, because that was the only tool that reliably made me react in the past. She said the entire situation could calm down if I stopped being stubborn and acknowledged I had treated Grant unfairly. She tried to frame the apology as maturity and closure, which was almost impressive in its audacity, considering she had brought this man into the center of our marriage dispute like a weapon. I didn't argue with the premise because arguing would have validated it, and I didn't mock her because mockery is another form of emotional payment. I let a small, controlled smile appear, not because I felt amused, but because the smile signaled that her lever no longer moved me. I told Dean that the apology demand was unrelated to lease policy and unrelated to occupancy, and I said I wasn't there to adjudicate personal feelings in a property office. Then I looked at Lila, not with anger, but with a kind of steady clarity that makes people feel exposed. And I said I would address our relationship through civil terms, not public pressure. I opened my bag again and pulled out the separation packet sleeve, keeping it face down for a moment, because timing is a form of punctuation. I placed it on the table between us and slid it slightly toward her, not as a threat, but as a boundary made visible. The words on the top page were enough, even upside down, because paper has weight when it contains consequences. Lila's face drained of color so quickly, it looked like a physical response, and her eyes flicked to Grant as if asking him for a line they had not rehearsed. Grant's expression tightened, and for the first time, he looked less like a guest and more like a man who realized he might be part of someone else's trap. Dean leaned forward, eyes narrowed on the packet, and asked what it was, and I told him it was a civil separation agreement prepared in response to ongoing interference and boundary violations. I didn't read from it, and I didn't explain my pain, because pain is persuasive only to people who already care. I simply said that future communication and access would be handled through documented channels, and that any further third-party involvement with my lease account would be contested formally. The room went quiet, and even through the glass wall I could see movement in the lobby slow, as if people sensed the temperature change. Lila tried to speak, but her voice caught, and she recovered by shifting to accusation, saying I was blindsiding her, that I was punishing her, that I was making everything worse. The problem for her was that none of those claims answered the procedural questions on the table, and the more she leaned into emotion, the more she looked like the person trying to escape the record. Dean cleared his throat and suggested a pause, and I agreed, because pauses favor the prepared. I gathered my sleeves calmly, leaving the packet on the table for one more second longer than necessary, and I stood, because standing changes who controls the oxygen in a room. Dean said he would review the account contact issue internally, and he asked me to email him my documentation, and I nodded, because his request was an admission that the meeting could not end with me labeled as the problem. Lila stared at the packet as if it were a foreign object, and Grant watched me with a new kind of restraint, the kind men adopt when they realize the other man is not going to swing first. I zipped my bag, thanked Dean for his time in a tone that implied the meeting was now his liability, and walked out without waiting for anyone's permission. In the lobby, the doorman's eyes followed me with something like respect, and the two women near the package shelves stopped pretending to read labels because the story had just changed shape. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, and as the doors slid open, I felt the first real certainty of the week settle into my chest. Lila had expected to return as the author of the narrative, and she had expected my apology to serve as ink. Instead, she had just seen that the narrative could be replaced by paper that did not require her agreement. As the elevator rose, my phone buzzed with a new message notification from her, and I didn't even need to read it to understand the shift, because desperation always sounds the same when it arrives. I stepped back into my hallway, heard the latch click behind me, and realized the next move would not happen in private, because she had already learned that private no longer worked on me. The message sat on my lock screen like a flare shot over dark water, because she never wrote when she felt stable, and she never wrote when she had nothing to lose. I kept my thumb away from it for a full minute, not out of suspense, but out of discipline, because the first person to react is the first person to bleed. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and set it down without drinking, because I wanted my hands busy while my mind stayed clean. Then I opened the message and read her words twice, once as a husband who had once believed her, and once as a man who had learned that every sentence is a tool when she is cornered. She said she did not understand what I was doing. She said this was cruel. She said I was embarrassing her. And she said I was forcing her to choose sides in public. She added that the building meeting had been unnecessary and that I had turned a private relationship problem into a spectacle. There was a final line that tried to pull the old string, the one about me being cold, and her needing me to prove I still cared. It was almost funny, because she still thought my silence was a mood instead of a method, and she still believed I would sprint back toward anything that resembled reconciliation. I locked my phone and put it face down on the counter because the only reply she deserved was a receipt. An hour later, a different notification slid across my screen, and the content preview was enough to show me she had already moved to Plan B. Dean had emailed a meeting summary, which he had called informal, but the attached PDF had the shape of documentation, and it included phrases like resident concern, safety, and mutual tension. He had written it in the same neutral tone people use when they want to sound fair while they build a case file, and he had copied Lila on it, which meant she had pushed for the paper trail the moment she realized I could outpaper her. I read the summary carefully, because a summary is a story with the verbs selected, and the verbs in his document made me the moving part. He mentioned my refusal to cooperate, he mentioned my unwillingness to engage respectfully, and he referenced an intent to follow up with next steps regarding access and occupancy, which was a polite way of saying that someone was already drafting the punchline. I took out my folder and opened to a page I had printed the night before, the lease policy excerpt that described authorized contacts and third-party communications, and I placed it beside Dean's summary like two photos in a lineup. The difference was not subtle, and the difference was useful, because the only thing stronger than evidence is evidence that reveals bad process. I drafted my response slowly, keeping every sentence clean and boring, because boring is harder to attack than emotional. I asked for a correction on record regarding Grant's presence in the account thread. I requested confirmation that his contact access had been removed, and I asked for a written statement that any future decisions regarding occupancy would be based only on lease clauses and documented violations. I attached the highlighted email thread, I attached the lease section, and I attached a dated photo of my evidence sleeve next to a clock on the counter, because time-stamping is how you turn paper into pressure. Before I hit send, I printed the email and signed the back of the first page, because I wanted physical continuity in case anyone later claimed I had fabricated anything after the fact. I placed the signed printout into a clear sleeve with a date label, and I took one more photo of it beside the morning newspaper, because I have learned that the simplest proofs are the most insulting to liars. Then I emailed Dean, and I copied only the building's general address, not Lila, because I wanted Lila to receive information through official channels rather than through the intimacy she no longer deserved. When I finished, I felt my shoulders drop a fraction, because paperwork is the closest thing to control that humans are allowed. By early afternoon, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was Grant. His name showed on the screen like a stain, and I stared at it long enough to remember how he had sat in that room pretending to be calm while he watched my marriage get carved into pieces. I let it ring out, because a missed call is a timestamp, and timestamps are a kind of currency. He called again 10 minutes later, then sent a message that was careful, almost polite, saying he wanted to clear the air and avoid misunderstandings. It was an interesting word choice, misunderstandings, because men like him only call betrayal a misunderstanding when they are afraid of consequences. I did not answer him, because my silence was doing its job, and because the worst thing you can do to someone who needs control is deny them a stage. The next escalation came from the building itself, which was how I knew Lila had moved to her favorite tactic, outsourcing her conflict to institutions. A notice appeared on my door from the leasing office, the kind of notice that tries to sound routine while it signals authority, and it requested that I attend a formal occupancy review meeting in the clubhouse conference room 2 days later. The reason listed was dispute resolution and community safety, which were vague enough to apply to anything and sharp enough to intimidate. My name was printed in bold, and the time slot was set for 6 in the evening, which meant maximum audience because nothing says fairness like scheduling your humiliation when everyone is home to watch it. I walked the notice down to the lobby and asked the receptionist calmly whether this was standard procedure for a marital dispute, and her eyes flicked toward the hall as if she could already sense the gravitational pull of gossip. She said she did not know. She said Dean handled those meetings, and she offered to take a message. I thanked her and left, because my argument was not with her, and because I wanted her to remember that I had been courteous when everything turned loud. In the elevator, I noticed a new scuff near the buttons, a little nick in the metal, and I thought about how buildings collect signs of conflict the way bodies collect bruises. People would watch this meeting like entertainment, and Lila would present herself like a victim, and if I played my role wrong, the building would remember my face as the problem. That evening, I did the opposite of what she expected, which was work in advance. I went through my email and saved the original thread headers as a printed chain because headers show routing and routing shows intent. I organized my evidence into 3 categories: policy breach, unauthorized contact, and narrative manipulation, because categories make people listen without realizing they are listening. I added one new piece to the folder, a screenshot of Dean's meeting summary PDF file properties showing the creation time and last edit time, because timing reveals panic, and panic reveals who is driving the pen. Then I wrote a 1-page timeline table on paper, date, location, event, documentation, and I signed it, because a signed ledger looks like something that belongs in a file, not in a fight. At midnight, my doorbell camera notification chimed, and I watched the still frame appear, 2 silhouettes in the hallway, one of them unmistakably Lila from her posture, and the other a man with Grant's build. They stood close to my door for a few seconds, not long enough to knock, but long enough to be seen, and then they walked away. I replayed the clip twice because it was almost too convenient, and convenience is suspicious. They were not trying to speak to me, because if they wanted communication, they had phones. They were trying to create a story about access, about fear, about the husband who refuses to cooperate and forces the wife to do desperate things outside his door. It was a stupid move in the long run, but it was a clever move in the short run, and it confirmed my growing suspicion that this was never just about an apology. I saved the still frame and printed it, because a printed timestamp is harder to argue with than a phone screen. Then I wrote down a single sentence beneath it. Observed outside door at 12:07 a.m., no knock, no contact, and I dated it, because a clean note is another brick in the wall. I did not call anyone, I did not confront anyone, and I did not post anything, because my goal was not to win a social war, my goal was to win a procedural war. When people want you to react, reacting is the trap, and I had already decided I would not feed their appetite for spectacle. The next morning, Lila texted again, longer this time, with more emotion and more accusations, and she included a threat that sounded like concern. She said she would tell the building she felt unsafe if I continued to refuse to apologize, and she said she would do whatever she had to do to protect herself. There it was, the real engine. The story she planned to weaponize, the claim that would turn me from husband to hazard. I read it once, then took a screenshot, and I placed it into the folder as a secondary corroboration, because threats are evidence when they are written. Then I did something she would hate. I replied with one sentence that offered nothing emotional and everything procedural, telling her I would communicate only through documented channels and that any claims made to the building would be addressed formally. 2 hours later, Dean replied to my earlier email with a careful answer that avoided the heart of my questions, and he said the occupancy review meeting would proceed as scheduled. He said it was for the benefit of all parties. He said it was an opportunity for clarity, and he said all residents deserved a safe environment. He still did not cite the lease clause that allowed a third-party contact to be added, and his refusal to cite it told me more than any admission could. He also attached an agenda for the meeting, and the agenda included a line about proposed access adjustments, which was a soft phrase hiding a hard plan. I printed the agenda, highlighted the line, and placed it behind my timeline sheet, because now I could show a pattern, not just an incident. By late afternoon, I received a message from a neighbor I barely spoke to. the kind of neighbor who always seems to know things without ever being directly involved. She asked, casually, whether everything was okay, and she said she had heard there was a safety meeting. I thanked her, told her it was a standard occupancy review, and I kept my tone light because I wanted the gossip chain to carry a calm version of me into the room before I ever walked into it. In this building, perception traveled faster than elevators, and Lila had likely been feeding the story to anyone who would listen. If the building entered that clubhouse room believing I was volatile, the minutes would be written with that assumption in mind. That night, I prepared the final piece I needed. Not a dramatic confession, not a secret recording, but a simple request that would force the building to commit to paper. I drafted a short letter addressed to the management company, stating that I contested any access adjustment based on unverified safety claims, and requesting that any decision be supported by specific lease violations and documented evidence. I printed it, signed it, and placed it in a certified mail envelope, because certified mail is the adult version of being heard. Then I taped the sealed envelope to the inside of my folder, because I wanted it ready if the meeting tried to end without accountability. When I finally lay down, I did not sleep well, because my body still believed this was a fight, and fights are noisy even in silence. Around 3 a.m, my phone buzzed again, and the lock screen preview showed a new message from Grant, shorter and sharper, and it ended with a suggestion that we could all make this easier if I stopped escalating. The phrasing landed like a fingerprint, because he had used the same language in the meeting without realizing it. I saved the screenshot, added it to the folder, and I felt the second twist settle into place with cold clarity. Because now it was obvious that the apology demand was never about respect at all. It had been a trigger phrase, a pretext, and a trap designed to manufacture an incident and justify moving me out. At sunset the next day, I dressed in plain clothes that looked neutral, because men who dress like they are going to war get treated like they are going to war. I checked my folder, checked the sleeves, checked the certified envelope, and I left my apartment with the calm of a man walking to a meeting, not a man walking to a verdict. In the lobby, the doorman looked up and nodded, and I wondered how many stories he had heard already, and how many of them had my name twisted into something ugly. I walked toward the clubhouse conference room, and as I turned the corner, I saw Lila waiting near the entrance with Grant beside her, and Dean standing with a clipboard like he was holding the door to a courtroom. Lila's face carried that same rehearsed softness again, but her eyes were too bright, and Grant's posture had the stiff confidence of a man who believed the room would protect him. Behind them, through the glass, I could see chairs arranged neatly around a long table, and I noticed something that made my stomach tighten, because it was both petty and precise. Every chair had a single sheet of paper placed on it, and the pages looked like copies, and the layout looked like a packet, and I realized someone had decided to turn this into a public reading before I even stepped inside. I tightened my grip on my folder, felt the certified envelope press against my palm through the cover, and understood that the meeting was already in motion, whether I spoke or not. I walked into the HOA clubhouse room and let the door close behind me without hurry, because hurry is what guilty people borrow. The board sat in a semicircle beneath the washed-out banner, and the secretary had a laptop open like a small courtroom. Lila was there in a pale coat, chin lifted, trying to look like she owned the air. Her ex, Grant, hovered close enough to claim protection and far enough to deny partnership. The HOA president started his speech about neighbor peace and safety concerns, but I asked him to confirm the exact clause that allowed an access code change. He stalled, so I placed a clear sleeve in front of the secretary with the lease clause highlighted and my certified letter receipt number visible. I set a one-page timeline beside it, dates, places, payments, and the short notes that tied them together. Nobody gasps at a timeline, yet everyone leans in, because paper does not plead. Lila tried to frame my refusal as cruelty, saying I owed Grant an apology for old wounds. I did not debate wounds. I asked for one fact. The night she claimed she was at a late volunteer meeting. I showed the shared calendar week view I had exported, and the header proved the committee never met that night. I followed it with the merchant alert from my account for a hotel lobby bar tab, and the timestamp matched her alibi window exactly. Grant attempted a smile that said charm could erase numbers, but the smile died when the secretary asked for his full name for the record. The president asked what I wanted, and I told him I wanted the minutes to reflect evidence received, and a formal review opened. The secretary typed those words while the cursor blinked like a metronome. I requested a short recess, then returned with the stamped copy of my separation filing receipt because my wife had demanded loyalty under threat. Lila went ghost white when she understood the papers were real, and the threat had expired. Grant stood to leave, but the president asked him to remain while the policy line was read into record. The board voted to revoke Grant's guest access pending review and to issue Lila a violation notice for misrepresentation. Lila reached for control one last time, but control needs silence, and the room had receipts. I collected my packet, nodded once, and walked out with the only sound I trusted, the secretary finishing the minutes behind me.